Hello and welcome to this special episode of Pause with Nandini on NRI Affairs. On the heels of Dalit History Month, we want to turn the lens today inward into privileged, caste privileged spaces, Savarna Brahminical privilege, going beyond performative platforming, and in some cases, re traumatizing of Dalit voices, and really talk about what the experience, the personal experience of caste privilege looks like, and what is the journey of coming into an awareness of caste privilege. And we hope that we can actually further the conversation on how caste continues to exist in covert and overt ways in contemporary society, and explore the difficulty of having these conversations in our own social networks, in our families, with our friends, because these are things that typically meet a lot of resistance. And lastly, also want to talk about how we can take greater personal and collective responsibility to really work towards the annihilation of caste. I have some wonderful guests here with me, and I will have them introduce themselves in just a minute. But before that, I do want to clarify that the intention is really to draw more people from caste privileged backgrounds to share their stories, to own their stories, and even to say things like, look, I didn't know. I think I don't know and I didn't know can be really powerful windows and starting points. So I encourage everybody to listen to this conversation with an open mind. And of course, share your feedback and your thoughts. The intent is that we will have a series of these conversations. This is the first of hopefully many. At some point, we will also invite Dalit leaders, spokespeople, people from the arts, from academia, who would like to share their views on what we are trying to do and hopefully help us or guide us if they choose to in how to do what we're trying to do better. And together, the idea is that we co-create a framework which is based on recognizes the innate respect and humanity of everyone, and create this framework that can be used also to educate caste privileged people in schools, in colleges, in corporate sectors, even in government, so that we can all work together and really, really try and address this the best we can in our lifetime. So let's just begin. I'd like to introduce my first guest, Avyaya Singh. If you'd like to just talk about yourself a little bit.
Hello, I'm Avya Singh. I'm 19 years old and I'm currently a second year student at Swarthmore College, which is in near Philadelphia in the United States. And right now I'm pursuing a degree in political science and computer science. And one of the main things that I'm doing at my college right now is to try and include caste as a discriminatory feature in the anti-discriminatory clause of the college, along with the help of a professor. And in order to do that, we are planning on setting up an Ambedkarite Students Collective at our college.
Thank you for that. Ria, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Ria, and I'm quite a mixed upbringing. I come from parents who are interfaith marriage. So my mother is Catholic, my father is Bengali Brahmin, and I'm also a third culture kid. So I grew up between the US and Bangalore for most of my adult life. And then I chose to live in Bangalore since 2011. My family still lives in the US, and so my identity with religion and caste has been, well, very interesting. I'll get into it more when I stop my thing, but otherwise I'm a writer in Bangalore, and I also write a lot on mental health, caste, and gender, and I also do branding, as you know, to pay my bills.
Thank you for that. And now we have Mudit Vyas with us.
Hi, I'm in Melbourne. I'm actually, my heritage is Gujarati, but I grew up in Udaipur, Rajasthan. I I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I study the phenomenon of diversity washing. I just finished my master's thesis by research, and yeah, that's pretty much it.
All right, we'll hear a little bit about your thoughts on caste in this particular conversation. Thank you, everyone. Before we begin, I do want to talk a little bit about Dr. Ambedkar, the guiding light on this caste discussion, and his seminal path-breaking work, the most famous speech that was never delivered, the annihilation of caste. So I'll just set the context a little bit with that, and then we can jump right into it. I'm reading from an article by Scott McLaughlin, who's a PhD in sociology, and I just found it a very apt little summary of what I wanted to say. So Dr. Ambedkar was the 20th century's most influential Dalit leader. He drafted the Indian Constitution and was a powerful critic of the Hindu caste system. He is often thought of as a jurist, economist, social reformer. It's hard to find many figures who can be said to have had a comparable influence in modern Indian history. Above all, he was an arch critic of the caste system and a leader in the fight for Dalit liberation. The word caste was applied to the Hindu system of social stratification by the Portuguese in the 16th century. It's derived from the Latin castus, in Portuguese, casta, meaning lineage, pure or chaste. Now, these are very relevant words in the caste discussion. For over 1,000 years, however, South Asia has been governed by caste relations, also known as the jati system. Simply put, caste or jati refers to a system of vocational guilds that over time became organized in relation to principles of purity and impurity. Each jati, of which there are literally thousands, has its own norms of conduct, and from each jati follows a series of subcastes. The caste system, as it actually works on the ground, is called jati. However, each jati also fits into an overarching hierarchy of the fourfold Varna system. I know all of this may seem a little bit academic at this point, but it has a real bearing to how caste plays out today as well. So I just want to explain it. The authority of Varna is derived from its codification in the Vedic Brahmin Manu Smriti, Laws of Manu, one of Hinduism's revered books. The Varna system outlines 4 castes, which is Brahmins, which is the priests, intellectual, Kshatriyas, which is warriors, administrators, Vaishyas, who are farmers and traders, and Shudras, who are the workers and laborers. Outcasts from the Hindu fold are those that don't belong to any Varna. So the Adivasi tribes of the subcontinent and the untouchables or Dalits, depressed or broken people who are seen to pollute Hindu society, right? That's the way it was stratified. As the lowest of the low, Dalits were assigned the most unclean tasks, which is removal of waste, tending of funeral pyres, butchery, etc. According to the Hindu caste system, there are 2 aspects. One is, of course, men, women, and children are divided into these communities. And the second is that they're also in graded order. So there is a hierarchy, and again, it's on birth. So it's pretty much the luck of the draw. Ambedkar, his father was an officer in the British Army, and he was allowed to attend school. He belonged to a Mahar family, which is an untouchable caste. And, he set out on this lifelong journey to agitate, educate, and organize against the injustice of the Hindu caste system. And just as a very, very small example of what he himself faced, through his school days, he was segregated from other children and forced to sit in a corner of the classroom by himself. If he was thirsty, he had to wait till the tap could be opened by a touchable person, lest he touch and pollute it. And if such a person was unavailable, he would go thirsty. So I think even just that small little example demonstrates what this whole caste system actually does and did on the ground. Yet, despite considerable barriers, Ambedkar became the first from his community to complete high school education. He went on to gain a BA in economics and policy and politics from Bombay University, and then won a scholarship to study economics at Columbia University, New York City. He subsequently completed his doctoral studies at the London School of Economics. His views on caste have been immortalized within his critique, The Annihilation of Caste, published in 1936. It was first prepared by him to be delivered as a speech to Society of Hindu Reformers in Lahore, but as we are seeing even now, there is censorship, so they weren't very comfortable with it. They wanted him to change a few things in it, and he said, I'm not going to change anything. And then he self-published his book in May of 1936. So that book is itself a lifelong study on the subject. And, a lot of people who want to understand caste better, I would imagine that's really a work that you cannot miss. His speech opens with a volley of evidence on the daily tyranny practiced by Hindus against the untouchables. It was written approximately 10 years before India achieved independence, and the thrust of its critique is that in its current state, Hindu society was unfit for political power because he said that there can be no political reform unless there is societal reform. And coming on the heels of the Indian elections, I think this is a very timely moment for us to even have this conversation because we are again making a stake for democracy. And if we're talking about democracy, we have to talk about society, we have to talk about caste. According to Ambedkar, the destruction of belief in the sanctity of the Shastras, which is the precepts and rules of the Hindu religion, is an essential prerequisite if India is to become a modern, progressive, and moral nation. His legacy has left a deep imprint on Indian society. On one hand, there are legions of Ambedkarites who are faithful to his critique. On the other hand, there are parties such as the Bharatiya Janata Party who have worked to co-opt Ambedkar's legacy while erasing his foundational critique, which is the irony of the whole thing, his critique of the Hindu caste system. So since the beginning of India's democracy, caste has played a crucial role. Major caste groups vie for political power, and caste is used as an instrument by politicians in need of votes. To be sure, Ambedkarism is a living force in today's modern India, and as long as the Hindu caste system remains in place, the concept of the annihilation of caste will remain as relevant as ever. So that's just my starting point. For us to better understand the fact that caste has been a battle for a while, and in some ways, contemporary society, urban contemporary society, tends to dismiss conversations around caste because perhaps it is not as in your face as it was in certain aspects, but certainly for the people who experience it, it is far more in your face than we can imagine. With that, what I want to begin with mapping our own journeys and our caste privilege locations. So I'll begin with you, Ria. In what ways have you seen caste discrimination normalized in your environment? And how and when did you have this realization that it was not okay?
Yeah, so it's in the last decade I've been only kind of been obsessed with this idea of caste and how it's kind of gone invisibilized for most people, especially in an urban Indian context. And then you add this factor that I also didn't live in India for many years of my life. I was in the US, and a lot of it was what we came from my particular identity, which was interesting, was because my dad was Hindu and my mom was Catholic. They never imposed any religion on us. Yet a lot of the protocols, what I'm calling protocols now, protocols, or the way you're supposed to behave, or the way you're supposed to receive people, or how you respect elders, is something that what are supposed to be proper manners, Indian values, okay,
Yes.
quote unquote. These are the things that I thought were what Indian values are. And it's only later when you start reading, like, no, that's caste protocol, and it's nothing to do with how all India sees Indian values, right? And that's because the bubble of the urban lives are so so insulated, like don't talk about that, but behave that way. So for me, caste is a series of behaviors, which we can get more into, stuff that I've picked up on over time. But what was never normalized for me is because as a kid coming to live in India when I was 10 years old, coming from the US, I could never understand the concept of that silent division between what people portrayed as poor people, very poor people, and rich or middle class people. And I couldn't, that wealth, it's not just the distribution of wealth, it's the way people decided to behave with each other. That's something that I could not articulate as a child, but felt very wrong.
Thank you for that. Avyay, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so for me, I think since I was born and brought up here, it's something, caste is something which is very deeply sort of ingrained in society. And so it was something which was very normal. Like we never questioned it, we never really thought about it, but we knew. Yeah. And I think that also comes from what I've previously, like in the few years that I've spent studying caste, I've also like written about this, and I call it like the privilege of ignorance, which upper castes have, where we can just ignore what caste does, how it affects people, and even the topic of caste itself, where there are people who claim to not know anything about it, and therefore they claim that, therefore they are okay, or that they don't actually benefit from it. So for me, it was very normal growing up, and the use of words like derogatory words towards caste was also something which is very common in school and everywhere, in the city, in urban life. And so for me, really, the turning point was studying about it, basically, when it was just something. Um, I mean, in fact, I can actually point to my political science book in school, where we had a section on the hidden apartheid, which talked about caste in India. We didn't read that section in school, but it still stuck with me because of the photos and the text on it. And I think that really stirred me from within, and it provoked me into actually reading on it and reading Ambedkar. And from that point on, I think I sort of realized my own privilege and started to question.
Thank you for that. Mudit.
I have always been a statistician, an amateur statistician to begin with. When I was 18 in 2006, the Mandal Commission report was instituted and implemented. It had already been implemented in government jobs, but it was implemented in government education in 2006. And I was 18, I was starting college that year. So up until then, my parents used to talk about how there's 22.5% reservation in education. And that year it went up to 49.5%. And so I just wanted to know what the numbers were. Like why should I have only, I mean, I'm quoting myself, 18 years old. Why should I have access to only 50.5% of the seats? So then I read the Mandal Commission report over time. But yeah, obviously it was summarized well in different media then. I found out that 27% reservation that is being implemented for other backward classes, they actually make up more than 50% of the population. And there are like there's strong statistical evidence that they have been marginalized for a very, very long time. The 22.5% reservation, 7.5% exists for Adivasi students and 15% exists for Dalit students. And yeah, I realized that this is a majority of the population that is completely, and these are like rough numbers, but this is more than a majority of the population, significantly more, that has not had equitable access for a very long time. And less than 15% of the population is crying about how now they don't have access to all of the 100%, but only 50%, despite having access to private education, coaching, and all of the Akash, quota, wherever they go, we go to study for entrance exams, or did. So yeah, that was the sheer numbers actually was the main watershed moment for me. Yeah, I studied the lived experience of it. Obviously, I lived a very privileged life. So I studied the lived experience, or as I call it, the phenomenology of it later. Now, that has been a part of growing up with this. So yeah.
I'll give you a little bit of background for myself as well. So I am Bengali. I didn't always grow up in Bengal, but I would visit, and I lived for many years in UP, in the north, in Kashmir, in Bombay. And the way that I would see caste play out and be normalized, I remember in my childhood more in terms of slurs that were used in the playground, in school, and very normal to use now what I know are caste slurs. But at that time, it was just a way of being funny or being, being rude to someone. The other very common way, of course, is how in homes there are different classes for guests, different classes in which you can offer water to delivery people who are coming to your door. And I would notice these things, and there wasn't really a discussion around them, but these are just things that fueled a certain curiosity about how some people are different and some people are not different. And for instance, that there could be a help in the house who's actually feeding the child with her own hands, but she has to have a different plate to eat her own food. And just these contradictions didn't really make that much sense to me. The other sort of thing, impression on me was that as a Bengali, there's a great emphasis that was, and it's probably, it's an urban Bengali thing that many people will recognize, on culture and arts and music and dance and all of this. And it's taken me many years to understand how those are such spaces of privilege. And by itself, maybe, it's not that they may be overtly, destructive in any way, but there is this blindness, this privilege of that, this blindness to that privilege. And also there is gatekeeping, because there's a very strong sensibility and aesthetic that is sort of celebrated. And anything outside of that is typically seen as folk culture or folk dance or folk music. And this othering and this idea of what lives in the center of culture and what is outside of it, I started to question, and I started to try and kind of get my head around that and read a little bit more. And this whole idea of the Bengal Renaissance, which is again something that progressive Bengali middle class or rich families have a strong identification with. Like in my great grandmother's puja room, there was a picture of Raja Ram Mohan Roy and Vidyasagar, who are known as people who reformed the Hindu faith. And then when I studied a little bit deeper, I did come to understand that the Bengal Renaissance does leave out a lot of the Dalit voices. So the Bengal Renaissance is centered mainly around upper caste Brahmin reformers, and it doesn't really take into account the anti-caste work that was happening in Bengal at that same time. And I came across this article, and I'm happy to share links along with when we publish this. It's called Dalit Resistance During the Bengal Renaissance, 5 Anti-Caste Thinkers from Colonial Bengal. I had no idea. I would never even know, no one would even speak about them. It's written by Mahitosh Mandal, and he mentions names like Hari Chand Thakur, Guru Chand Thakur, Mahendranath Karan, Rajendranath Sarkar, and Mahendranath Malabarman. I have never heard of them. I have to explore them more, but this is just a small example of how there's been such an erasure of anything that isn't dominated by the Bhadralok or the upper caste Bengali, in terms of having control over that discourse. I also came across another article written quite recently on the 20th of March by Shubhajit Naskar, who says a casteless Bengal is a carefully curated facade by the upper caste Bhadralok society, which gets a free pass and is never questioned. So these are some of the things that are, that are fueling my curiosity and my intention to dig deeper. And of course, another huge influence is actually having friends from Dalit community, and I've been very fortunate to have friends who are willing to share their own struggles, share their resources very generously, and that have helped me understand the issue a little bit more, in a little bit more detail. So that's a little bit about my background. One of the things that I do want to talk about next is the question of appropriation. We are having this conversation that undoubtedly will be seen in different ways by different people, and I will not be surprised if, for some people, upper caste privileged Hindus who haven't discarded maybe their Hindu faith in its entirety, talking about caste itself is an appropriation. And I would like to hear from Mudit first, since you do have an academic background, and of course you do talk about whitewashing, diversity washing, all of those things. So you are familiar with this idea of appropriation. And what are your views on that? I know in literary circles, there's a lot of talk about that, where it's about giving the stage and taking the stage and passing the mic and making your own stage. And we have all of these conversations, but how do you think about that?
I think the appropriation you're trying to address is that the medium that we use to talk about things is largely a medium which is inaccessible to the majority. So I think the solution is not to stop. I mean, we can't stop anyone from saying what they want or like researching what they want, because the West, especially the Western academia, where most of upper caste driven caste research is happening, is driven by supply and demand. And there is a demand for more research on South Asian dynamics. And so the upper caste academics are providing it. So nobody can stop that. A lot of good work, I'm guessing, is coming out of all of that in terms of knowledge generation, I guess. But what consequences is it having? I'm not so sure. We'll probably have to wait and see. But I think cultural appropriation in literal terms would mean something different, where people, and because I have studied cultural industries and art, I think we haven't reached that stage yet, but it might happen where there is more television-based representation for characters that are Bahujan. I guess there's more cinematical representation, and in that case, I would like to see more writers and more actors that come from Bahujan backgrounds who participate and partake in all of that. So, yeah, I don't know if I answered your question completely.
No, you did, because I mean that's one, certainly that's one perspective. Essentially saying that you should not sort of stop any voice, right? So you should be able to speak. And
yeah, I don't want to stop any conservative voices either. Like,
right,
everyone has the right to their speech. But yeah, I think the progressive circles that actually talk about caste are having certain negative consequences especially in terms of how they're imposing how racial dynamics work in the West onto the caste conversation. And that is very counterproductive because these are not the same. These are not, the, these social structures are not similar at all. And so, yeah, like, especially a lot of young people who come and talk to me about doing their research on caste, uh, it's that is my first warning to them, that do not be driven by like the dynamics that govern anti-racism politics in the West. Because if you apply those principles and like those ideas onto this conversation, it will not fit. It will not be a productive conversation. So I think that is another form of appropriation we need to be wary about. Like, people want to be trendy, and so they take Western concepts, which it doesn't work.
Thank you for that. Avya, since we're talking about caste in the Western context and frameworks of racism being applied, do you have an opinion or something you'd like to say about appropriation and in the context of that?
Yeah, I think perhaps my position is a little different from you guys, because so in 2020 I did renounce Hinduism like completely. So I converted to Navayana Buddhism on the 15th of October. And so perhaps it's a little different, but of course doesn't mean I'm not upper caste anymore. That doesn't, yeah. So, and I come from a family where half is Hindu, half is Sikh, also an intercaste marriage, but both are upper caste. And so for me, I think it's also like navigating the conversations where appropriation can come about. And I believe like the best way to go about it is to just ask, really. If you have friends who may be Dalit, or if you have anyone who's like who has written on these issues on caste, then it's, and you also want to write on it or you want to talk about it, you can ask them, you can, do something like that. And for me personally, I do a lot of I do art online, and a few times I have made, like portraits of Ambedkar or Jyotiba, and in those instances I have asked um, people who are Dalit artists or other folk who are in this field whether or not it would be okay for me to post them or show them to other people. I don't sell them or anything; it's not commercial, but even then, and I think that would be crossing a line, and in my opinion, um, to sell it for commercial gain, where it's just the face of Ambedkar. So for me, the best strategy is to just ask.
Thank you for that. Ria, what are your views on appropriation?
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting question, right? So, first of all, I think it's really good what you've tried to do here. You've brought us here, and what's important is the lens, right? And I think, Mudit was talking about, how half of America's academics are doing caste, and a lot of the critique coming from different communities, like, why are Dalit people, why are Bahujan people always under the microscope? Why aren't Savarnas talking about the way they live their lives, the way they have been so caste blind, so just absolutely like ignorant half the time? So why aren't we studying our own culture? And now, of course, we're living in a time where there's going to be negatives to everything. So I'm here to say that I think two truths can exist, Nandini. One is, here we're trying our best to talk about from our lens how we have negotiated caste and what we have to do to rectify it, because I think everybody has at least that moral duty to think about it, and to, depending on who you are as a person, but you have a small moral duty to start thinking about that and creating infrastructural change, which is very difficult, easier said than done. The other thing is that this truth also can exist, that some people will say that, oh wow, a bunch of Savarnas sitting and talking about their privilege, haha, must be nice. Sure, that's also a truth. that exist within the same world, that we have to still do something about it. Because if not, if we don't do it, what's the alternative? Going back into our past bubbles, going back into our, these little bubbles where we can only just talk about it on Instagram, and nothing else happens. We don't introspect, we don't encourage each other to call each other out. So I think it's very important.
Thank you for that. Yes, I do think part of this is also like calling our own bluff, right? And as much as we will talk about it, try and understand it, we will not have the lived experience of someone who has been oppressed. And to recognize that is, I think, a first step. And the second thing about appropriation is that this is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this, because each year I see, the Dalit History Month comes and goes. There's so much platforming now, right? There's so much platforming of Dalit voices. And still, we expect all the hard work, all the labor to be done by Dalit people talking about their oppression to the point where it is almost commodified by privileged spaces.
Yeah.
The idea is that, there is enough out there. If we want to educate ourselves, we can. And again, turning the sort of mirror to ourselves and to say that, look, we are learning about what it has done to you, but let us learn about us and the fact that we carry the legacy of people who have undoubtedly, at least at the very least, benefited from caste oppression. That's the very least, if not been active oppressors. Because a lot of us, and my family included, will talk about things like, oh, we were big landlords or zamindars in Bangladesh or whatever. What does that mean? What was that? What was that setup? Did that not
Exactly.
include some level of oppression and some level of gross inequality as a starting point? So even to recognize that as something can make people very defensive. Oh, but we are very generous family. Oh, we look after
Yeah.
our very well. Oh, we educate their children. Oh, we pay bonus for Diwali. So the conversation gets derailed about the fact that we do all of these things and not the systemic problem that it's grossly, there's inequality and based largely on caste. The other place I want to talk about appropriation is, as you had said about benefiting financially from, Abhay said, if he were to sell his paintings, and that for him would be crossing a line. And one of the things I really appreciate in Australia is that whenever in social or, in public spaces, when they invite an Aboriginal person to come and share or to deliver an acknowledgement of country and all of that, those are paid things. You do not take free labor anymore in that sense. But that's again something that I feel is quite important to consider, that if we do want to platform, if we want to champion, we must try and find ways in which there can be some sort of a compensation, a remuneration, and to acknowledge that there is labor involved in that. It is not just someone coming and sharing their story for your consumption. There is a labor, there is also an emotional labor that goes into uh, what we are asking of them. So that's the way I think about it. Again, it's a nuanced conversation, and I don't think it's definitive. But yes, I do err on the side of Mudit, what he says, that he's not about censoring. Everybody should be able to say. Of course, we then have to be open to criticism, which is part of the deal. Right. So now the next question: what ways have you found to be a true ally in your experience? And I only ask this so that other people listening can reflect and maybe get ideas of how to be a true ally. Now, what Baba Sahib had said, that breaking up the caste system, the two things, one is intercaste marriages and the other is destruction of religious scriptures. So for you to for you to give up Hinduism and adopt Nabhayana Buddhism, I would say that that's a very concrete step that you have taken, which is towards annihilation of caste. And if I talk about intercaste marriages, maybe in our context, we can also extend that to friendships and close relationships and communities and intermixing of communities. So if anyone wanted to take that, open.
Yeah, I can briefly talk about so first of all, I just want to mention though, like a lot of my anti-caste learning, the context setting, right, has come from Ambedkarites and many Dalit leaders online who have given us the lens and language to look at it without this, and Nandini, because you were talking about the whole Bengali thing, and I think this Bengali upper caste thing is a story of its own, right? Because we feel that like what we're taught is we will talk about caste, we will talk about communism, we will talk about all of this, and most feudalistic people, but have that intellectual air about them, and that's what I saw, right? And then I realized, wait, that's actually caste pride. So what I was going to say is that because my parents were interreligious, I still saw that force of, okay, you don't have to pick a religion, and therefore I've never had any religion. I did do go to Hindu pujas, I go to church, but it's just like I never had one intact religion. So, but I still saw the force of protocol, which was actually Hindu caste, come through in the way that you're supposed to behave, in the way you're supposed to study, in the way you're supposed to do pranam, all of these things, right? That bhodro is was inculcated, like that is the language. And then as I grew up, and now I'm married in a intercaste marriage, as in my husband is a intercaste kid, and so like one parent is Dalit, one parent is Brahmin, and for me it's like my mom is Mangalorean Catholic and my dad's Bengali. So yes, there has been a lot of learning through each other to understand that there's so many things that maybe were very tough for me as a child, but were definitely not obstacles because we're not even thinking about those things. So that's why I
Yes.
say lived experience, no matter what we study, we're not thinking about those things. We can get better at it, but we still can't kind of live within those walls. So, it's
And to be a good ally, then would you say is to be good listeners, to be open to learning about other people's lived experiences? And in the context, I think, of culture, I think to be a good ally would also include not having such strict walls around what is cultural and what
yeah,
is outside of culture, and what is refined and what is base, and all
yeah,
of these things I think come into play as well, because of course you can have your preferences, and your preferences are based on your upbringing and your socialization, but to
yeah,
not immediately dismiss something outside of our lens
yeah,
as not cultural or not worthy of being called art or being on the outside. So that's one way in which I think we can be better allies.
yeah,
Other, of course, is this thing about representation. I do believe like empowered representation. So whether we are putting together committees or whether we are putting together anything representative uh, to actually have representation which is empowered and which can be in leadership roles,
yeah,
and for us to willingly actually facilitate that, I
yeah,
think is maybe a way of being true allies. And the third thing I want to say is about language, because a lot of these caste distinctions come across in having access to a certain dialect, a certain accent, being able to speak English in a more neutral way than perhaps someone who doesn't have that. And again, recognizing those limitations within us, within myself, to feel like, okay, this is the way that I appreciate English being spoken because of the way I was socialized. And
yeah, exactly.
therefore, broadening our acceptance and being able to listen. So that's the other one. Mudit, any thoughts on being a good ally?
I think the biggest change I've had is I've tried to implement is that I've started questioning, like Ria also said, you don't just, it's not just about, I mean, obviously the root of caste is in Hinduism, but caste exists across South Asia. So there are chimeric caste structures in within the Muslim society as well. There are Ashraf communities who only marry Ashrafs, which is
Christians are casted. In India, Christians is a small caste.
especially in Goa. If you go, they call themselves Baman, and which is
Yeah,
basically a
I heard that's
localization
so
of
weird.
Brahman.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
They'll
I've
only
heard
marry
that.
the Burman Christians, and even in Pakistan, it's very common. Ashrafs will only marry Ashrafs, and there is a very uh, widely practiced untouchability in Pakistan, and there are no reservations in Pakistani society or in constitution. It's very prevalent in Sri Lanka as well, uh, very prevalent in Nepal. Uh, it exists in the Buddhist society in Sri Lanka within their structures of how things operate. And so, yeah, I've faced it because a lot of people that are not Hindu that come here, I'll address the Hindu aspect in a bit. A lot of people, non-Hindu people that come to the West in the diaspora, they don't feel like they're responsible for addressing this prejudice within their societies, or like even calling out their own privilege, because they have done their bit, and India is like a Hindu majoritarian country now, so they are also a part of a minority. So I think I've started questioning that. Hindu, nobody actually identified as Hindu ever till like very recent times. The word Hindu colloquially was accepted when the British actually tried to do a census. And so upper caste Hindu leaders were like, we have to register ourselves as Hindu and not as our caste. People used to just write their caste when it came to religion in censuses, or like nobody ever considered Dalit people Hindu till it became an electoral issue post independence, and even before independence, like there were elections before independence as well. And so this creation of Sanatan Dharma, it has made the problem of caste much worse, specifically because now Hinduism in the West, in the diaspora, and this is what I see the most, is a minority religion. So it gets cultural representation, arts funding, festivals, whatever. And so that becomes a problem because within a minority representation sort of structure in a culture, it's very hard to question something, because then it becomes like racism, or I don't know, there's always like you become Hindu phobic, which is like a big thing now apparently. So
Oh, I know that discussion.
all of that out is major allyship, I feel, because it really alienates you in India and in the diaspora, especially if you're working in the corporate sector in India and you talk about these things. Nobody wants to talk about these things. And in the diaspora, all of academia, all of business leaders, all of the art world is upper caste largely.
Yeah.
So if you bring these things up, it's just considered unnecessary agitation. So I think that agitation is necessary.
Yes.
Yeah, I think you said it really well. Like what both you and just Nandini just said is that I think that the when you know focus it, the real allyship over here is making ourselves uncomfortable, because if we're going to speak up at these places where, and you bring up these uncomfortable conversations within Savarna community, and then you're suddenly like ostracized, or like, oh, you're too political, or you're being too weird, or you're not educated, you don't understand. So we have to build that very thick skin and say, shoot back right there. That confidence has to be built in sitting
Yes.
in discomfort.
And one of the things I will say is that it's also being able to uh, have a language around this conversation. And because our peers and our societies don't know how to talk about this without feeling defensive, without feeling like you are being blamed for something that was
Yeah,
historically done, and now you have a corporate job and you don't discriminate against anyone, and therefore how is anything your fault?
yeah,
So we don't have a language of acknowledgement. And my friend Yogesh says this a lot, where he says that it's not my fault, but it's my responsibility. And it's everybody's responsibility. So that sense that, you know, it's not necessarily that you are responsible for every single thing of oppression that has happened, but you have benefited from this structure, and it is also in our benefit to have a more equal society, to have all of this talent, all of this potential that is unrealized in so many people because of lack of access. It would improve our society if more people had access to the same things that we have. It, you don't know what ideas could come out, you don't know what creativity could come out, you don't know what kind of poets or scientists or engineers or business people could emerge. And someone else, I don't know if Mudit you had said this, or someone else said that, when we talk about reservation, for instance, oh, how are people getting in on different skill sets, we don't recognize that the exit point is the same for everybody. Everybody has to pass that exam. So people can come in from different points, but they all have to learn a certain thing to be able to move on to the next thing. So
Yeah.
you had said that, no, Mudit, in our last conversation. I found that very interesting. So why don't we create structures where people who are in that system, everybody has to exit at the same place? Why don't we enable everybody to do well, depending on which point they have come into that system from? So if someone needs extra help, they need help with English, they need help with anything else, that's where we should be focusing, rather than trying to gatekeep and say, no, you can't come in because you need this percentage to come in, whatever. Anyway, so that's a different
That's a different podcast. But yes.
reservation will be a different podcast, but I do, in this context, want to talk about my dear friend Gautam Benegal, who is no more, and who was someone who has given me great inspiration in feeling like people can change. So when Gautam's son in India did not get a seat somewhere, because at that time he had ranted a little bit about reservation and this and that, and then subsequently the child went abroad and whatever happened, but then he had this realization that he had spoken badly about caste and reservation, and then he changed his mind, and he actually apologized, and he actually said, now I get it, I understand. I understand the need for affirmative action, for reservation. So that makes me feel like it is not a lost cause, and it may take time, but people can change.
I mean, first of all, I just wanted to also bring up the fact, what Mudit was talking about, that different religions also have caste inbuilt in them now because of the
Yeah.
effect of Hinduism. And one thing which was very interesting to me about that is that even Judaism, which is very small in India, it has like less than 10,000, or used to have less than 10,000, probably even less now. Even Judaism has caste in it and has differing levels of, stratification within it, which is just insane to me how that
Yeah.
happened. Other than that, in general, I think allyship, as you had mentioned, and for me, the biggest step is to give up Hinduism and take up Navayana, which, as Ambedkar had found out throughout his studies, was like the best sort of religion to get out of caste, and the best religion which had checks and balances to prevent caste. And I completely agree with that. And so I took it up, but it's not just say I am a Navayana Buddhist and that's it. It's also to follow it. It's also to, take, I mean, whenever you become a Navayana Buddhist, you have to take 22 vows, as Ambedkar did. And in those vows, there are vows where you prevent, for example, where you prevent pujaris from doing pujas, doing Hindu pujas, where you give up your belief in Hindu goddesses and Hindu gods, where you denounce caste wherever you see it, and you denounce inequality wherever you see it. And to actually take that up and to embody that is more important, I think, than just saying you're a Buddhist. And I also completely believe in what Ambedkar said, where he said, educate, agitate, organize. And I also believe that as like a step-by-step process where you first have to educate to get agitated, and and then when you get agitated, your next step should be to organize around it. And so for me, the first step and the most important step is to educate yourself. And most people in India, in South Asia, they are educated enough where they know what caste is, where they know their own caste, or they know, that, Dalits are untouchables or stuff like that. But they don't know beyond that, where, they don't recognize it, they don't, they believe that their privilege is like divine and that it should be, and they don't question it, most importantly. And I think that is the first step where you educate yourself and like figure out what you need to do and why this is bad and how you can come out of it. And I also believe reading Ambedkar really is the best step because he delves into everything which is caste related. And so for me, for example, I've read more than like 40 of his books uh, by now, and I'm still like continuing. And if you read some of it, it's just if you are a Hindu, if you are an upper caste, if you are someone who has like even an ounce of empathy in them, then if you read that and you still remain upper caste, you still believe that your privilege is God given, it's just, I mean, you're basically like like inhuman at that point. Because like the things he talks about, which are very true, like many, for example, I can give two examples here which are important. One is that in many temples across India, there used to be a practice where a mang which is an untouchable caste, a mang person was sacrificed and their body was placed at the foundation of the temple to build it. So if you go to some of the temples in Maharashtra today, especially the ones dedicated to Mangir Baba, who is the god, or like the what is called the Kul Devta or the caste god, there probably is a Mang person's body underneath that temple. So
Mm.
that is one thing, absolutely insane. That happens, that happened, and no one really cares. And the other thing is that many people believe that untouchability is the lowest of the low, like the highest evil. But untouchability is just the tip of the iceberg because there are two more like rungs beyond untouchability which are not talked about. One is unapproachability, where people are or where people who are from the unapproachable caste are refused or like they can't approach an upper caste person beyond a certain distance. So like for example, if it was like 100 meters, you can't get closer than 100 meters if you are an unapproachable caste or from an unapproachable caste. So like if for example you want water, you would have to wait like 200 meters away. And the worst even than that is unseeability, where you can't look at someone who is from an upper caste. So unseeability is like the lowest of the low, where like if you think about it, these people can't go outside of their villages in the day because they'll see an upper caste, in the street. And so what they do is they are basically nocturnal now. That's their only way of like living because they can't be seen. And there's no research done on this at all on these castes, on unapproachability and unseeability. And like for me, the only way to research this and learn about this was through Ambedkar. And since he talked about it like 100 years ago, we have no, or like, we have no way of knowing what happened to these people or how they are today, whether unapproachability or unseeability are still practiced. Stuff like this, where it's so devoid of humanity that if you learn about it, you will start questioning yourself. So I think for that reason, education is the most important thing you can do.
Gosh, thank you for that. That's such valuable information to think about. And what you said about education, the way I also think about it is that there is this idea of connection before correction. So these barriers that people have, it's not from lack of access to the information. It's just that there is resistance. And I think the challenge is that how do we make that connection with people where then they are able to self-correct and they are able to be educated in the truest sense. But thank you. I do think that is the first step. And this is our humble attempt in that direction. And what you've done and what you're doing is so fantastic. So thank you for sharing some of your perspectives on the issue. Any comments on that, on what he
No,
said?
I completely believe that, yeah, education, but what you said, connection is so important. And when I say connection, also is the lens, because when we studied about the caste system, so even I was in 11th and 12th and did sociology, it's all academic, right? So, like, it is very like, this is the Varna system, this is the this thing. And Ambedkar wrote the constitution. Yes, huge deal, as he did. But also, you have completely erased his main purpose, his main critique, his radical intelligence that Dr. Ambedkar had is completely erased from your childhood because it is not taught to you in that way. So how
Yes,
do we start? Like, I think the biggest way to connect is to teach children in this way of like, look at this man, this is what he said. And there's also like Jyotibai Phule and Savitri Phule and Fatima Sheikh. I mean, these were revolutionary people doing this kind of work at a risk and a cost which I don't think we can even imagine, you know.
yes,
That and the whole the education system of how Gandhi was idolized in the way that we think as Indians, and the fact that what the invisibility of the intellectual issues that Ambedkar had with Gandhi, which were very public, and if you look into it and if you read
yes.
about it, then like you said, it's there. But
It's all
are we
there.
connected enough to read? It's all there. Yeah.
So that's basically the premise of this. It's there. Let us all educate ourselves and educate
Yeah.
each other and try and make those connections where this kind of learning doesn't meet with resistance and meets with acceptance. And I think it's a good segue then into the last thing that I wanted to do. One thing I will say that when I publish this, if there are any resources that any of you want to share with me in terms of links, I can add that on so that can start to begin a resource on this platform that kind of educates others on the things that have helped us, but also, as I was saying, going forward as a framework that I want to think about, which is going to actually capture all of these things that we've spoken about: the fact that caste exists, the fact that we need to relook at our faith and the principles of our faith, and the fact that we need to find ways to address it in actionable ways so that we don't continue further generations of oppression or erasure. And would love some thoughts from everybody here on what you think would be the primary things that should be in this framework. For me, it is respect. How do you recognize the innate respect of a human being? And so what does that look like in actual terms? But I'd love to hear from everybody else.
I think one important thing that needs to be in this framework is definitions. Like, definition of what people understand caste is and what it actually is. Like, what is the difference between a Varna system and how does the caste system is superimposed on top of that? What is the definition of a Bahujan? Bahujan literally means majority. So if we're talking about a majority, who are we talking about? What just people don't understand the demographic, the statistics behind everything. I think reductionism has become a major problem, because now it's easy to talk about things. People can pick and choose what they want to be activistic about,
Yeah.
as opposed to like what actually they are a part of in terms of being direct oppressors or like being advantaged. So I think all of these things are important. I don't think self-flagellation is going to work, because people I've seen, so I've not been on social media for a while, so I don't understand what culture there is right now.
Good choice. It's toxic as hell.
But it's always, I understand there has been a lot of community organizing on the part of Bahujan communities on social media, and there have been obviously means and ways that have been implemented by the Savarna structures to erase that. But at the end of the day, I've understood that there is a major lack of understanding, and being confronted is not how people want to learn. So yeah, I know confrontation at sometimes is necessary, but I haven't been able to figure out, because I have been involved in a lot of confrontations, academic debates, and other forms of argumentations. Uh, I've always encountered an unwillingness on the part of people to learn. So yeah, we need a framework where we can actually talk about facts, which is what Ambedkar did mostly. He just wrote down the facts. A lot of his work is just facts. Like, he's not even giving his opinion in a lot of places. He's just talking about facts, and he's rationalizing, this is what exists and this is what it has led to. So much of his work is just that. And so yeah, why do people avoid accessing these things? Obviously the obvious like the surface level answer is that if they don't want to be uncomfortable, but then largely we see in the corporate structure, everybody wants to be like diverse now. Everybody wants to be some trendy form of activist. So I want to see where those two things overlap. That people actually want to learn facts, and the facts are actually palatable to people.
Yes, I think this is a mood, like this is a central question about wanting to engage with a topic academically, socially, activism space, and not wanting to or not willing to look at it in ourselves and our own privilege. So that's sort of, I think, the place that we are trying to operate in, which is, yes, there is a community together that wants to address this, but it will need personal accountability. Ria, what thoughts on framework?
So I think that, yeah, like, Mult was saying that there is all the facts are out there, right? Connection is missing, but also I think this is more of a global idea of what anti-oppression politics really is, right? Dr. Ambedkar is probably the most phenomenal advocate and writer on these on this. Okay, but there's, when I go back to bell hooks, or I go back to Audre Lorde, if you look at what they're saying also is the same thing, is that we all have to look at the casteism within us. Because of a capitalistic system or whatever system we are in, we are also not good enough until we do this, or everything is roles. So I have empathy for a world where the human spirit has been crushed by capitalism, by the roles that we have to, the rules, which is also a part of caste, which is part of privilege, which is, it's so messy, where we forget that how do we make connection and one goodwill for humanity, right? And a part of that is to actually look at, what we've repressed inside. And I think the denial, or the reason people don't want to talk about it, is because they are so scared of carrying all of the world's shame on one back. And I don't think that's helpful either. I don't think shame just, it's important to, within privilege, people say, hey, isn't it crazy how privileged we are here, because we don't even think about these things. And it's really good to point it out to your friends and your circles. But I don't think just, flagellating online and saying, I am privileged, I accept it, that doesn't change anything. That doesn't do anything. Just putting the facts also doesn't, just putting what Ambedkar said on your story does not also do anything unless you're also padding it with, well, how are you negotiating it within your space? And to say this is one monolithic way of, that it's happening, it's not. India itself is so varied. The way we, what we decide is okay to say or not okay to say can vary from a 5 kilometer radius. So it's really important that we take that onus to figure out how are we practicing it, whether or not we think we are. You talked about the English example. There's so many ways that you have there is a Savarna lens, and you have to accept it that no matter what, we will have a Savarna lens, but go from there. Then you're opening, you're listening, and you're really making a space for diversity and dialogue, is when we can be uncomfortable and have good faith in each other, no matter who we're talking to. I think that's
Yes.
the only way.
I love that. I love that, having good faith in each other, and also the fact that when you have empowered representation, then you are no longer sitting on top saying you are allowed to speak. You are now going to get the stage. Then
Exactly.
everybody's got a voice, and you are just one voice among many. And I think that's a good way. Avyaya, what do you think?
I mean, I agree with what has been said. And I also think that even though education is like supremely important, oftentimes what happens, like within not just this, but in like every sort of activism space, is that it's just sort of, you know, you educate yourself and then that's it. People think that that's all you need to do, or that now that they've educated themselves, they're not privileged anymore, or that they can speak on it, like they're experts and stuff like that. And I think that, and although that seems like something, I think it doesn't actually achieve anything beyond like a single individual or a few people getting educated on it. That's really it. So I think even though education is important, the most important step is to organize around it and to actually concretely do something about it. And so for me personally, my like my initiation into this organizing step is in my college, where I'm trying to like introduce caste into the anti-discriminatory framework, and to have like a students collective around it, stuff like that, where we can educate other diasporic Indian folk who usually tend to be either caste blind, like they don't
Yeah.
know about caste, or they're just like national, like Hindu nationalistic, basically. So, so that is my first step. But in our respective spaces, we can do more steps like this, And as Suraj Yengade has said in his speeches, we must be, and it's quite provocative, but it's the perfect statement. We must be a Brahmin suicide bomber, where we must go into our spaces, like back into our spaces after we've educated ourselves, and like bomb it, basically, where we change the institution, and we make people aware of what is going on and how we can change it. And that is also another important factor of this, which is to recognize the history of it, to recognize how we can sort of connect it with other struggles that exist across the world. And one, I mean, great example of this is the Dalit Panthers, who, are very inspired by and were, very like connected to the Black Panthers in the United States, and have this sort of movement which is more broad based, so that we can gain more support. And the last sort of factor, I think, is to recognize and to think about, to discuss the method by which we can annihilate caste. I mean, obviously we want the annihilation of caste, that's our goal, but there are differing ways of doing that. And one of the main sort of divisions which exist within Bahujan society, that I've like come across in my studying, is that one is caste pride, where certain, like there are matang. There's a, I mean, caste called matang caste, which is a very which exist in the same fold as Mahar and Mang, and they seek to be proud of their caste. They seek to be, that sense basically. Then there's also caste like the Chamar caste, which again, it's they seek caste pride. But there are also other castes which do not seek caste pride, which seek to completely distance themselves from their caste and from caste itself. And so recognizing that these two exist and can exist at the same time is also very important, I think. And how we can reconcile them or not, and have differing strategies at the same time, I think is very important in our study of caste.
That's such an important point because, yes, you're not dealing with one single block or a monolith, right?
Yeah.
And I personally have come across two absolutely different viewpoints from Dalit writers where one is taking full ownership of being a Dalit or taking pride in being a Dalit, but retaining the agency to do that themselves, to not be identified by others as, say, a Dalit poet, but it's for them to say whether they want to, whether that's the hat they're wearing, depending on context. And the other perspective I have encountered is someone has told me that, look, yes, I was born into this Dalit identity, but it doesn't mean anything. It's a social construct. I refuse to identify with it, and I refuse to justify it. I refuse to engage with it. It's got nothing to do with me. If you were to say that I'm a pink elephant, that's your problem. It's not my problem. So that's the way that their perspective is, that I'm not going to self-identify with something that is just a made up construct. It's got no actual physical, on grounding. So yes, again, recognizing that there is a diversity there. And like you said, that there is also diversity in how we engage with the issue. For someone, there is a radical way to engage with it, which is an example that you cited. And then there will be different ways and softer ways or medium ways or more engaging or more connection building or more community based. And I think there's space for all of those conversations, and we need to have all of those conversations to find a framework that at least can seem authentic, can seem useful, and that actually can be actionable as we take this conversation along. So thank you so much to all of you for sharing this. Yes, you will, of course, Mudit.
Yeah, I think another important aspect of the set framework is, so I talked about definitions when I started talking about framework, and I said, okay, caste is something, I talked about caste, but I didn't really define it. It is something that you inherit by birth. It is an occupational label. It is endogamous. You cannot marry outside of it. These are like rigid definitions. And there is an internal hierarchy within your Varna between castes. So these four things have always defined caste. And one thing that Ambedkar always stood by was the fact that we need intermarriage. But eventually what happens is people still have a lot of religious marriages, even when they are between upper caste people and upper caste people of different faiths. They so they'll do one ceremony in a, I don't know. I have seen my cousin getting
Yes, I've seen this too.
Yeah, they're both getting married both in a Gurdwara and at a Hindu ceremony. Both upper caste people, one Khatri, Sikh, and one Brahmin. So yeah, they're still religious marriages. They can choose to register it as a Sikh marriage under the Sikh Marriage Act or the Hindu Marriage Act. I would like to see more marriages being registered under the Special Marriage Act, where nobody is signing off. It's just between two people. I think we
I want
of intermarriage under the Special Marriage Act. That was an important law that was written by Dr. Ambedkar, and the power it has always been downplayed, but it shouldn't be.
I just want to quickly add on to that, Mudit, because you bring up the Special Marriage Act, and I think it's a really great place to act. That is one of the most valuable foundational rights people technically have. And unfortunately, even caste has given that to be a privileged act. So I did the Special Marriage Act in 2021, just because out of principle. But they put your pictures up there now. So we are privileged enough that our parents don't care. We don't, there's all this liberalism and all that stuff. But I'm saying for the average person, you're putting a picture in your community registration center and giving that 30 days for anybody to come and interfere. And so the violence of caste and religion, like, imagine just like Muslim Hindu, there are goons going out there looking for a Muslim Hindu match just so they can go and like mess with them, intercaste marriages. So I'm just saying that even it's what Ambedkar said, right? It's like we can have all these things in place, like something as amazing as a Special Marriage Act, which is so foundationally important, and yet it's the people's mindset that just create these things. Because Special Marriage Act is about agency, and caste when practiced right is does not give you any agency.
Yeah,
And I think that's the terror that people want to avenge or whatever. But yeah.
yeah. The act has been diluted over time, and it is quite problematic. Now that waiting period is 2 months, and I
What,
think
really? It was
and
30 days. Oh my god, this is getting worse.
completely abolished the act, and
uh,
people don't. I don't think people understand how important intercaste marriage is. Like it's a fact. Even intercaste friendships, how do they happen? People don't understand the
exactly.
of it. What is the mechanism of two people from different castes even talking to each other in an educational institute? How does a Bahujan person even land up a private sector corporate job? What is the mechanism of that? Years and years of privilege being built up through reservation. And so there is no understanding. So how do two people even meet? People meet at work and people meet in colleges largely. Or through
Yeah.
friends. And if your friends are all upper caste, if you're going to a private sector corporate job where everyone is upper caste, or you're studying private B school where everyone's upper caste, how are you?
I'm making notes for the framework. Keep talking. No, but I do think these are really important real life questions. And I'm glad you brought it up. Friendship, spaces, gatekeeping, even constitutional rights, people being aware of what is actually there for them to avail of. And how do you create frameworks where more people across castes can meet, can interact, can marry, and also take away the stigma of reservation, take away the stigma of of where you've come from and how you speak and what your cultural background is and all of that. Since we've gone into another bit of discussion, Avya, do you want to have anything to say? I thought I was keeping this conversation going for too long, so I should wrap it up. But evidently, I have very engaged guests, so we can have a little bit more time.
Yeah, I think especially, of course, intercaste friendships and stuff like that are also important. Like non-institutional relationships are also important. But I believe Ambedkar specifically is more keen on intercaste marriages because a marriage is institutional. And since India has been sort of built on caste, and the state itself is now, built on caste, marriage is, and the Hindu Marriage Act and stuff like that. Marriage is a Hindu institution where it is Hindu, and so for Ambedkar, when he talks about marriages, when he talks about caste, he talks about how even arranged marriages, like as a concept, is based in caste where
Yeah.
where you seek to remove the surplus man or remove the surplus woman and keep population in check, keep the number of people in each caste in check, so that there is no intercaste marriage, and there is no sort of even possibility of there being like rebellion against caste because there is an intercaste marriage. And so for that reason, I think intercaste marriages take precedence over any other relationship because they are institutionalize and give you the agency to actually question caste as a concept itself, away from the construct of Hindu identity.
Thank you for that. Yes, I think that's an important perspective as well. In terms of next steps, of course, the idea is to welcome more conversation and more debate. And from all of you, based on what we have discussed, I would love suggestions for other things that we can talk about, some areas possibly we haven't covered. I do get a sense that there is a lot more, obviously, to be talked about, and even from all of you. But unfortunately, we do have to wrap this up now. And maybe we'll have another session where we can explore some of these things in more depth, especially things like reservation and things that we've touched on but not really gone very deeply into. But thank you so much for your time, and hopefully we'll share this far and wide, and we'll have many more people join the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nandini, for getting us all together. It's wonderful.